Oh, good evening, everybody. This is so official. It's an introduction of an introduction of an introduction. So welcome. I won't take up too much of your time. I just want to say that I'm so thrilled that Christopher has arrived. He's traveled far for this across the world. And he's not just only a brilliant scholar, an artist, a writer, but also a dear friend. So it's an honor to introduce him. As an official, I'm a founder of a nonprofit organization called Project A, which is the study for the aesthetics of Western esotericism. So we're very interested in how, not just to talk about the great philosophical ideas, but how they influenced the greatest art, and how that in turn influenced our life, and how we can see the art in a new way and influence it. And so both us and the art continue to change and inspire us. And I see in Christopher this living tradition. It's not a scholar who's looking at the past, but who's making the past alive. And this is it's a real treat tonight. That's what we're about to experience together. On our website, Christopher McIntosh is actually a Project A scholar, and we have a fun introduction to him. Dr. Christopher McIntosh is that rare novice, a scholar who is also a fiction writer, an artist, a romantic dreamer, and a connoisseur of the bizarre and otherworldly. I should almost stop right there because I think this is a brilliant summary of who he is. But he has done so much and has offered so much in his writing that I want to mention just some of your books. His work includes, he has a PhD and he was born in Britain and spent 4 years in the United States and now lives in Germany. And his work includes books on the Western esoteric tradition, including the Astrologers and the Creed, Eliphas Lévi and the French Occult Revival, the Rosicrucians, the Rosicrucians and the Age of Reason, the Swan King, Ludwig II of Bavaria, and Gardens of the Gods. He also has a lot of fictional work, which includes the occult novel Return of the Tetrad, the spy thriller, and a short story collections which is titled Master of the Starlit Grove. Many other works as well, but tonight he is introducing his latest, Beyond the North Wind, and we are one of the first audiences that can get our eyes, hands, and minds on it. So without much further ado, please welcome Christopher to stage.
Thank you, Zhenya, and good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Good. Well, first of all, I would like to express my personal thanks to the University of Philosophical Research, the Project OR, and my publisher, Red Wheel Weiser, for making this event possible. As Greg mentioned, I had the privilege of meeting Manly Palmer Hall when I visited this place in 1982. And I found him to be a charming and delightful person, as well as someone with a most remarkable mind. Now, recently, I was delighted to find on the internet a wonderful and deeply inspiring lecture by Manly Palmer Hall on the Nordic myths, in which he comes up with some fascinating insights into the deeper meaning of the myths, and he's particularly interested on the subject of how the mythology is interpreted in the operas of Richard Wagner, which he describes as great mystery rituals comparable to the Eleusinian mysteries. So I think Manly Palmer Hall would be pleased that I'm back here today presenting this book. Well, I'd like to begin the presentation by posing a question. What comes to mind when you hear the word north or see the word north with a capital N. In other words, not north merely as a compass direction, but as a place with multiple associations. At the beginning of my book, I include a number of descriptions of the North in this sense, which were put together by the musicologist Marjorie Roth to go with a lecture that she gave on the music of the North. And she allowed me to quote them. So let me read out some of these descriptions of the North. Quote, "A place of early fading light, of rain, twilight, melancholy, and loneliness, a place of purification and escape from the limitations of civilization, a hard place, a place of uplands, adverse weather, remoteness, a place of quiet, a land of long snows, a place of darkness and dearth, a place of austere felicity, where virtuous people live behind the north wind and are happy. A shifting idea, always out of reach, always leading to a further north, to an elsewhere, a place of prodigies, icebergs, volcanoes, and the magnetic mountain, a place of treasures, a place of geographical and cultural isolation, simultaneously lush and hard, a place that is dark, cold, and timeless, a place where you can be truthful to yourself," unquote. Well, these quotations, I think, eloquently evoke the idea of the North as a place with a special mystique attached to it, a place of myth, legend, and mystery, but also a place associated with darkness, with the night. Just as in French, the South is often referred to as le midi, midday, so the North is sometimes referred to as midnight. And by the same token, the North has often been thought of as a benighted and uncivilized place, a backward place. When I was going to school back in the 1950s and 60s, the version of history that we were taught was that civilization essentially came from the south. It all started somewhere around the region that is now Iraq and went via the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans and went further and further north until all of Europe was civilized. So the early inhabitants of Europe tended to be presented as primitive barbarians with no culture to speak of. For example, the only thing I remember learning as a child about the ancient Britons was that they dyed their skin blue with a substance called woad. So I used to imagine these mysterious blue-skinned figures moving through the misty forests of ancient Britain and occasionally grunting to each other in what passed for language. And as for the religion and mythology of Northern Europe, I knew virtually nothing about them. In my education, aside from the biblical narrative, it was the gods of the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome that we were taught about. So I and my contemporaries could easily have said who Jupiter and Venus and Mercury were, but we would have been very hard put to it to say anything about, say, Thor or Odin or Freya. Well, now all that has changed. The North is back with a vengeance, and it's everywhere you look. In the cinema, for example, it seems like every other day a new film comes out about Thor or Beowulf or the Vikings. And then there are all the novels, computer games, comics, and so on, dealing with Nordic themes. Well, that brings me to the first slide. Here you see the cover of a board game called Yggdrasil, showing the god Thor battling with a terrifying monster, the Midgard serpent, from the Nordic mythology. And I have a chapter in my book dealing with the subject of the North in modern mass media. Also, many people are turning back to the worship of the old Nordic gods and studying the runes, the old Nordic alphabet, which is not just an alphabet, but a divination system and a set of powerful symbols. I'll come back to the runes later. There's also a new fascination with the idea of a vanished northern paradise, a sort of northern Shangri-La. This idea goes right back to the ancient Greeks, who called it Hyperborea, Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind. An alternative name was Thula, or Tula, or Ultima Thula, as the Romans called it. The legend really starts in the 4th century BC with a Greek mariner called Pythias, who sailed out from the Greek colony of Massalia, that is present-day Marseille, in a ship that may have looked something like this. He sailed out into the Atlantic and up towards the Arctic, where he reached a land of ice and fog, which he called Thule, and which may in fact have been Iceland. And with his account of this mysterious land, far away in the frozen north, wreathed in mist, Pythias set a legend going. And like a snowball, it kept rolling and gathering new layers of myth and legend. And people began to think of Hyperborea as a kind of oasis, a warm, verdant place in the midst of all the ice where an advanced civilization existed. So, could there have been a Hyperborea? In the book, I look at some of the evidence from linguistics and mythology. In Latin, the word for north is septentrio, which is cognate with the word septem, meaning 7. The Russian word for north is sivier, which again is cognate with 7. Why 7? Well, the north is where the constellation of the Great Bear, also called the Big Dipper, is located. And that constellation has 7 stars. There's a mystique attached to these 7 stars, which we find very widespread across the northern hemisphere. We find it, for example, in the Chinese Taoist tradition, where the Great Bear and the Pole Star are the source of healing energy that can be drawn down into the human body. Here's an illustration of this from the cover of a book on Taoist yoga by Mantak and Maniwan Chia, showing how this healing energy can be absorbed from the Pole Star through the pineal gland and from the Great Bear through the thalamus and hypothalamus glands. Did the Nordic peoples perhaps have some similar practice? We don't know, but it seems to me quite possible. The name Great Bear is significant. The word for bear in Greek is Arctos, hence the word Arctic. But why the bear? Well, the bear is found over a large part of the northern hemisphere as a symbol of the warrior caste. In Celtic, the word for bear is Arctos, a slight variation of the Greek, hence the name of King Arthur, or Arctos, the warrior king. And in the Germanic world, there is the tradition of the berserker, from berserk or berzark, meaning a bear's garment. So a berserker was a warrior who took on the strength and ferocity of a bear. The bear is also the totem animal of the goddess Artemis, whose name again is cognate with Arctos. Among the Celts, she appears as Artio. Here's a statue of her found in Switzerland, showing her totem animal, the bear. In Greek mythology, Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo. Both Artemis and Apollo have names consisting of 7 letters. And Apollo has a lyre of 7 strings and was born on the 7th day of the month. Furthermore, Apollo was said to have come from Hyperborea and to return there for 3 months every year. Now, I suggest that the name Apollo is actually a variant of the name of the Nordic god Baldur, who, like Apollo, is a god of light. Apollo is arguably also a shamanic god. His devotees went in for shape-shifting, astral traveling, oracular trances, and the like. These are all techniques typical of the shamans. One of the devotees of Apollo was Pythagoras, one of the key figures in Western thought, and it's been suggested by the British writer Geoffrey Ashe in a fascinating book called Ancient Wisdom that Pythagoras was a shaman coming out of the Hyperborean shamanistic tradition. Now, shamanism is an important theme in my book. If we look at the indigenous peoples of the Arctic region, I'm on the wrong slide there. No. If we look at the indigenous peoples of the Arctic region, the Inuit from Greenland right round to Alaska, the various Mongol peoples of northern Siberia and Russia, like the Yakut and the Buryat, and the Sami of northern Scandinavia, we find that they all have shamanic cultures. Furthermore, the Nordic mythology is pervaded by shamanism. A prime example is the story of how Odin hung for 9 days and nights on the world tree, the Yggdrasil, in order to obtain knowledge of the runes. Now, this was clearly a shamanic ordeal. And Odin has other shamanic features. He sacrificed an eye by throwing it into the fountain of Mimir, the god of wisdom, in order to obtain clairvoyant sight. He has totem animals, 2 wolves, 2 ravens, and a horse with 8 legs. And the Icelandic sagas are full of shamanic features, trance journeys into the underworld, guardian animal spirits, etc. Coming to the Yggdrasil itself, the world tree, the central motif of the whole northern mythology, the Yggdrasil encompasses 9 worlds: the world of human beings, the world of the gods, the world of the giants, the worlds of the light elves and the dark elves, the worlds of fire and water, the world of the dead, and the nether world of darkness and fog. The motif of the tree plays a role in many mythologies, often symbolizing the central axis of the world, the axis mundi, which connects different levels or worlds. In the Yggdrasil, it's 9 worlds, but more often in shamanic tradition, it's basically 3 worlds: the world of the gods, the everyday world we live in, and the underworld of the dead. Sometimes the tree is purely a symbol, sometimes it's an actual tree. We find counterparts of the Yggdrasil in many cultures. Sometimes it's a tent pole, as with the Siberian shaman and the Native American medicine man. We also find it as the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha obtained enlightenment, and we find something similar in the Jewish Kabbalistic tree of life. And a very interesting example from Chinese mythology, the Qianmu tree, which grows at the center of the world and has 9 branches which can reach out to 9 heavens, and 9 roots which reach out to 9 springs where the dead have their abode. So it's a very similar concept to the Yggdrasil, and possibly it's an example of the transmission of the northern tradition far beyond its original home. So possibly we're dealing here with a shamanic tradition inherited from the Hyperboreans. What other evidence do we have for Hyperborea? Well, we have the megalithic monuments like Stonehenge, shown here on the left. These have always presented a puzzle for archaeologists because they don't fit the theory that the ancient people of Northern Europe were primitive barbarians. In the case of Stonehenge, the sheer force needed to build it is almost unimaginable. It's been calculated that it would have taken the entire population of Britain at the time, working for 7 years just to raise the main circle and the central stones. And many of these megaliths reveal immensely sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge. On the right is another megalith, another megalithic site, the Callanish stones on the island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. Like Stonehenge, it dates from about 3000 BC, so it's older than the pyramids of Egypt. And there are many megaliths that are even older than this. Here's a remarkable set of artifacts from Scotland. These are stone spheres, averaging about the size of a tennis ball, carved in such a way that the surface is divided into a series of protruding circles. Now, the amazing thing about these patterns on these stones is that they have been found to correspond to the Platonic solids. That is to say, the 5 solid geometrical shapes that Plato believed to be the essential building blocks of the universe, as described in his dialogue, the Timaeus. You see these shapes shown at the bottom right. They are the tetrahedron with 4 sides, the cube with 6 sides, the octahedron with 8 sides, the dodecahedron with 12 sides, and the icosahedron with 20 sides. Now, Plato lived around the 4th or 5th century BC, but these spheres are estimated to date from at least 1500 BC. So they predate Plato by at least a millennium. So here again we can speculate that we're dealing with some footprints of Hyperborea. Well, then I go on to talk about the legacy of the North and how it has influenced our culture in all sorts of ways, our language, literature, folklore, customs, and much else. It's there, for example, in the names of the days of the week. Wednesday named after Woden or Odin, Thursday after Thor, the thunder god, and Friday after Freya, the Nordic goddess of love. It's there in folk traditions, such as the tradition that the stork brings children into the world. This is based on a beautiful Nordic tradition that the stork is a psychopomp, a carrier of souls who goes to the fountain of Wyrde beneath the world tree, where the new souls wait to be incarnated, and takes each of these new souls and places it in the womb of its future mother. Now here you see a couple of old postcards illustrating this theme. On the left, a variation on the theme of the fountain of Wyrde, and on the right, one showing a stork approaching a woman and trying to foist a baby onto her. And she is trying to fight it off with her umbrella. And the caption underneath reads, "And the villain still pursues her." Well, another part of the Nordic legacy, as I mentioned earlier, is the runes, the ancient Nordic alphabet, to which I devote a chapter in the book. There are two main runic alphabets, or futharks, as they are called. The first one, the Elder Futhark, shown here, has 24 letters. This appeared around the 2nd century AD and then rapidly spread, remarkably rapidly, throughout Northern Europe with some regional variations. The younger Futhark, which has only 16 letters, appeared around the 8th century and also spread rapidly. It's a bit of a mystery where the letters came from. As I mentioned earlier, the Edda tells us that they were revealed to Odin as he hung on the Yggdrasil, the world tree, which is possibly a metaphorical way of saying that they were invented by some Nordic bard or group of bards in a shamanic trance. They were used partly like an ordinary alphabet for writing messages, but they were also used for divination and for magical spells. The Edda and the sagas are full of references to the use of the runes for divination and magic. Today the runes are still very much alive. They're popular as a system of divination and even as a system of gymnastics or runic yoga, where the runes become a series of different body positions. And I, in fact, practice a system of runic gymnastics, which I find extremely beneficial. The runes were the alphabet of the Vikings. And that leads us on to the subject of the Vikings, to which I also devote a chapter. Today we tend to think of the Vikings as marauding savages wreaking havoc wherever they went. But there's another side to the Vikings. For example, they had a wonderful tradition of poetry, of great subtlety, involving complex rules of meter and alliteration, and elaborate metaphors called kennings. And poetry was very much part of their culture, so that even in the midst of a battle, like say a sea battle, someone would stand up in the boat and compose a poem on the spur of the moment, according to all the correct rules of meter and alliteration. And just to give you an idea of the resonance of Old Norse poetry, let me read the opening lines of the Völuspá, the sayings of the seeress from the Edda, where the seeress is asking her audience to listen to the ancient story that she's about to tell. And the Old Norse reads like this: Hliods bidek allar, helgar kindir, mögu heimdalar, vildu at ekvalföður, vel framtelja, forn spjölfira, þá fremstum mann. Well, when you hear that, you can almost imagine yourself in a Viking ship, hearing the wind whistling in the sail and waves crashing against the hull. Powerful, powerful stuff. But the Vikings not only wrote poetry, they made beautiful jewelry, and they were remarkably skilled shipbuilders. It's been said of ships like this one, that, this one in a museum in Oslo, that it took thousands of years of trial and error to arrive at a ship so perfectly designed for its purpose. So, again, maybe this is something that was inherited from Hyperborea. The Vikings traveled far and wide in their ships, and one of the places that they colonized was Iceland. And Iceland is an important place in this context because Iceland has led the way in the revival of the old Nordic pagan religion with its gods and goddesses. I have a special personal connection with Iceland, and the foreword to my book was written by my old friend Hilmar Örn Hilmarsson, who is head of the Asatru Fellowship, that is the pagan community in Iceland, and also a well-known composer who works works sometimes with a group called Sigur Rós. And earlier on, some music by Sigur Rós was played, Odin's Raven's Magic, a most remarkable composition. Anyway, here is Hilma being installed in a ceremony held at the place known as the Þingvellir, the site of the old Icelandic parliament. And from Iceland, the revival of the Nordic pagan religion has now spread all over the world, as I describe in the book. Another country that I have written about is Russia. And for me, this was the most fascinating part of the book to write, because in Russia, the whole mythos of the North and Hyperborea has taken hold in a big way. And it's having an enormous impact in many different spheres, in politics, in archaeology, in literature, and in art. And it's all bound up with the whole spiritual quest of the nation in the wake of the collapse of communism. Now, there's always been something of a mystique of the North in Russia. It goes right back to the Vikings, who went into Russia in the 9th century and founded the kingdom of Kiev, out of which the Russian nation grew. And the Viking heritage has often been romanticized in Russia. Here's a painting by the early 20th century artist Nikolai Roerich, entitled Guests from Overseas, showing Viking ships making their way up an estuary into Russian territory. Roerich later became famous for his expeditions into Central Asia in search of the legendary kingdom of Shambhala, the faraway utopian Never Never Land, which was later adapted and renamed Shangri-La in the novel and film Lost Horizon. Here's one of Roerich's paintings from that part of the world, and there's a collection of them in the Roerich Museum in New York. I don't know if any of you know that museum, but it's a most remarkable place and well worth a visit when you're in New York. Well, in Russia, the notion of Shambhala merged with a homegrown Russian legend, the legend of Byelovodye, the land of the white waters, which was another version of the same idea, the paradisical abode hidden somewhere over the hills and far away. And Hyperborea was yet another version of the same idea, a sort of Shangri-La of the far north. It was all part of the same utopian idea, which had a great appeal for the Russians and still does. A key figure in the story is Alexander Bartchenko, shown here on the left, who was a scientist, esotericist, parapsychologist, and popular writer in St. Petersburg in the early decades of the 20th century. Bartchenko was convinced that there had been civilizations in the past possessing knowledge of forces and energies unknown to modern times, and that one might be able to rediscover this knowledge if one could find out more about those ancient civilizations through archaeology. So in 1921, he led an expedition to the Kola Peninsula in Russian Lapland. Here. Right up north on the Arctic Ocean. There he found some astonishing things: an ancient paved road, rock paintings of gigantic human figures, fallen columns, and curious pyramids like this one. The expedition spent a year there, studying the remains and talking to the local people, the Samis. And at the end of it, they came to the conclusion that they had discovered Hyperborea. And Bartchenko was convinced that the Sami shamans were the successors to the priests of the Hyperboreans. He believed that the Hyperboreans had lived there in the north until the 5th millennium BC, and then most of them had been forced by climate change to migrate south and then east, eventually reaching India. Tragically, Bartchenko was executed in 1938 during the Stalinist terror, and the whole Hyperborean thing went quiet for several decades. Then came the fall of communism, and suddenly Hyperborea was back on the agenda. And since then, there have been a series of expeditions to that northern region, and they keep discovering more and more interesting things. For example, a man called Valeri Diomin, who went there in the 1990s, found a number of stone labyrinths, like this one, shown on the left. The interesting thing about these is that similar labyrinths are found all over the world, and Diomin was convinced that they originated in the north and then spread throughout the world. Another series of expeditions was organized by the archaeologist Sergei Golubev to the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea, just south of the Kola Peninsula. Golubev also found extraordinary things like this huge throne, shown on the right, roughly twice human height, carved out of solid stone. He also believed that he had actually found the remains of Hyperborea, and here's what he wrote about his discoveries. Quote, "On the islands in the White Sea stood the oldest sacred center of humankind. The more we try to understand the astonishing constructions of the Arctic or Hyperborean culture, the more we are convinced that they represent not only a national Russian treasure, but also a unique monument in the history of humanity, no less amazing and probably older than the famous Stonehenge in England and the pyramids of Egypt and Morocco." Unquote. But perhaps even more mysterious than the remains on the Kola Peninsula and the Solovetsky Islands are the extraordinary stone spheres found on the uninhabited island of Champ, located far to the north of the Arctic Circle. These spheres range from the size of a child's marble to several meters in diameter, and they're so perfectly formed that it's hard to believe they were not shaped by human hand, although some geologists argue that they were formed by nature underwater around an organic core. So, the whole theme of Hyperborea is now back with a vengeance in Russia, and it's having an impact in many areas of Russian life. It's one of the things that the Russians are turning to in their effort to rediscover themselves and their national soul in the aftermath of communism. If you're a patriotic Russian, it's very satisfying to be able to say, we the Russians are the true descendants of the Hyperboreans. And there are many voices in Russia putting forward this idea. You can see this in the huge number of websites that come up if you do a search in Russian for Hyperborea. And some of the things you find on them are pretty far-fetched. For example, according to one website, the Russians are descendants of a race that arrived in an intergalactic spaceship many millennia ago and settled in the region of the North Pole, where they remained until over 100,000 years ago, when a great natural catastrophe drove them out, and they migrated to the region of the Urals and became the Russians. So the Hyperborean phenomenon has taken on many different aspects in Russia, but the one that interests me particularly is the way in which it's given rise to a whole school of painting. A typical example is the work of Alexander Uglanov. Here you see two of his paintings. The one on the left is called Veda, as in the ancient Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, signifying an ancient wisdom tradition handed down among the Indo-Europeans and present in Russian mythology and folklore. As you see, the painting depicts a radiant goddess figure standing before a huge ancient tree with a human face and surrounded by three sacred animals of northern Russian tradition: reindeer, bear, and swan. The painting on the right is called Salt of the Earth. Now, this is very Hyperborean, showing an icy northern environment with a goddess figure holding what appears to be the pole star and hovering over an island in a frozen lake. Unfortunately, this image is not terribly clear, but in the middle of the lake is an anthropomorphic tree surrounded by worshippers. Here's another work by Uglanov entitled The Path to Asgard, showing an enormous Viking ship sailing through the air and appearing dramatically through a curtain of cloud. Another artist working in a similar vein is Vsevolod Ivanov. In his work, we find again many otherworldly Hyperborean landscapes. Here's a typical painting of his entitled The Exodus from Hyperborea, showing an endless caravan of sleighs pulled by mammoths, making its way out of a city resembling some northern Babylon, with towering pyramids, domes, and fairy tale castles, all snow-covered and glistening in the light of the sun setting over a distant ocean. Here's another work by Ivanov entitled Coastal Vision of the Hyperborean Goddess, showing an oceanside cliff with a shining female face looking out from behind rocks carved into weird human figures. And you'll notice in the foreground several of those mysterious stone spheres of the kind found on the Arctic island of Champ, as I mentioned earlier. And here's Ivanov's impression of what a Hyperborean port would have looked like. Now, it's very interesting to read what Ivanov writes about his own work, because it's clear that he has a strong agenda. This is what he writes, quote, "From an early age, I knew that the Russian people were and are being robbed economically, but an equally dreadful form of robbery is the distortion of Russian history. Only after many decades has it become possible to publish literature on the early chronicles of the Russian people. I, as a schoolboy, felt the need to give expression to that splendid heritage. My creative work is a bridge to the radiant and splendid world of our Russian past. In the act of creation, I become immersed in that world. The work of the Russian artist should have an illuminating function. It is necessary to actively oppose the globalization of art." Well, these paintings tell us a great deal about Russian culture and the Russian soul. Their creators regard themselves as having a mission to enlighten, uplift, and inspire. They strive in their works to convey beauty and light. Well, how different from the prevailing orthodoxy in the Western art world, where art students are told that art has nothing to do with beauty. But these Russian artists are taking the view that beauty is important, and that tradition is not something to be shunned, but something to be celebrated. The pictures also reveal much about the present spiritual mood of the nation and how the Russians are looking for a new vision, or perhaps looking to revive an old one. And some of them are finding that vision in the Hyperborean idea. It's not only artists in Russia who have been influenced by that idea, but also writers and thinkers. There's a whole school of thought which says that Hyperborea gave birth to Russia, and Russia gave birth to all the civilizations and all the languages of the Northern Hemisphere. One of the proponents of this view is Valery Chudinov. You can find many lectures by him in Russian in the internet. He has some very outlandish theories, but he puts them across in a rather engaging way. For example, I found one quotation by him where he says, "If you take Eurasia from Britain to Alaska, in the Stone Age it was all Russian. One forms the impression that Russian was the very language of which the Bible speaks, that there was one language before the building of the Tower of Babel, and that language was Russian." There's also a whole school of fiction in Russia based on this Hyperborean idea, which I also go into in the book. Well, now I'd like to come back to the question, was there a Hyperborea? If you look at conditions in the Arctic region today, it seems impossible. It's simply much too cold. But there is evidence that the Arctic wasn't always that cold. For example, in the Spitsbergen archipelago, which is only about 700 miles from the North Pole, they found fossilized remains of palm trees. So Spitsbergen must once have had a temperate climate. This could have been because at that time the Earth's axis was vertical, which would have meant that the temperate zone extended much further north than it does now. Or it might have been due to a shifting of the Earth's crust, so that Spitsbergen was originally located further south. So in terms of climate, Hyperborea would have been possible. In terms of actual evidence, well, we have the remains that I talked about, the pyramids and labyrinths in northern Russia, the megaliths like Stonehenge, the spheres shaped like platonic solids, and so on. All of this seems to point to the existence long ago of an advanced civilization in the north, which eventually disappeared, leaving only its footprints. Anyway, in my book, I weigh up the evidence for and against Hyperborea, and I leave it to the reader to decide whether the weight of evidence is for or against. Writing this book has been a fascinating journey, and I hope you'll share it with me by reading the book. Thank you.